Thank you for joining us for today's event. Please welcome President and CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership, Bob Harvey.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have you join us for our State of Education event today. As was just said, I'm Bob Harvey. I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership. We appreciate each of you taking time to join us this afternoon to take part in this discussion around what is a critical topic for our region, and that's education broadly, and then specifically higher education. While we look forward to the days when we can gather in person for these signature events, as we call them, we really do appreciate you tuning in online today, and we hope you continue to find value in these virtual state of events. I trust you do. This afternoon, we're joined by Dr. Harrison Keller. Dr. Keller is Commissioner of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and he'll share insights into the state of our region's higher education institutions. And after today's fireside chat, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So please utilize the Q&A feature on your screen to share any questions you would like to pose to Commissioner Keller. We'll be gathering those throughout the event. On your screen, you'll also find a link to our higher education information card, which features data on enrollment and demographic data on Houston's higher education institutions. So before we begin our program and hear from Commissioner Keller, I would like to take a moment to thank our event sponsors. They are our platinum sponsor, Calpine Corporation, our gold sponsors, Deloitte, SCF Partners, and UT Health, our silver sponsors, AT&T, BBVA, CenterPoint Energy, Lone Star College, Prairie View A&M University, Rice Business Executive Education, San Jacinto College, University of Phoenix, Veneer Construction Management, Inc., and WGU Texas. And our information card underwriter, Texas A&M University, College of Education, and Human Development. I'd also like to thank the partnership's signature sponsors who provide annual support for all of our events, our business resource groups, and our councils. So in addition to the support of our sponsors, I would like to acknowledge the partnership's 1,100 member companies for your investment in the partnership's mission. Without you, none of our work at the partnership would be possible. And finally, I'd like to recognize our elected officials who've joined us this afternoon, our extraordinary consular corps here in Houston, and the partnership's own board of directors for your leadership. Now, it goes without saying that the pandemic has dramatically changed everyday life for everyone around the world. And while the impacts of the pandemic are yet to be measured in the long term, one thing we know for certain is the unique impact that COVID-19 has had on education and students at all levels over the past 6 months. With the virus necessitating a swift mass shutdown mid-semester this past spring, millions of educational leaders had to shift quickly to virtual learning without much time to prepare. And suddenly students, faculty, parents, education leaders were all learning together as they navigated the path forward. While we saw socially distant graduations in the spring and over the summer and preparations for extended virtual learning, there are many challenges that the pandemic has brought to the forefront that are fundamental to students and our future workforce. One of those challenges that has been highlighted by the pandemic is the disparity that exists for our students of color and those in low-income communities. The topic of racial inequality and injustice has been much of the discussion this year in the aftermath of the killing of Houston native George Floyd and countless other events around the nation. And while systemic racism permeates all facets of our lives in many, many ways, there's no denying the correlation between race and educational disparities and educational outcomes. These inequalities are not unique to Houston by any stretch, but as the nation's most diverse city and one recently identified as a top global city of the future, it's our duty to ensure that these disparities are recognized and steps are taken to address them. Now, these are not easy challenges, but it's unacceptable that in today's world, many thousands of students across this region do not have an equal opportunity at success. Earlier this summer, the partnership launched One Houston Together, an initiative to address racial inequity and injustice in Houston. While this initiative will focus on many factors, addressing the vast inequalities in our educational systems will be a priority for sure. A strong education system is the bedrock of our region's long-term success. It is critical that Houston offers an educational system that only uplifts all students at every age, but also one that builds a talent pool that meets the current and future needs of our workforce. And this is why a fundamental pillar of our organization's strategic plan that we call Houston Next is providing opportunity for all. While several factors contribute to a system of opportunity, the partnership believes a strong education system and career pathways are both essential. Now, over the course of our organization's history, the partnership has been committed to addressing gaps in all levels of our education systems. Most recently, we've taken aim at improving student outcomes through policy changes, seeking transformational reform for public education statewide. You'll recall that during the 2019 legislative session, one of the partnership's priority issues was ensuring that the legislature worked to ensure a well-funded, accountable, and equitable public education system that serves all children and supports our talent pipeline. And thanks to the work of many elected officials and business leaders from the Houston region, and for the first time since 1993, transformational long-term improvements to the K-12 education system were advanced during the 86th Texas legislative session with the passage of School Finance Reform, HB 3. The legislation passed provided $6.5 billion in new state funding to the public education formula funding system and placed greater funding emphasis on proven programs aimed at increasing outcomes for all students. Now, shifting to our workforce development work, in 2019, the partnership's Upskill Houston initiative celebrated its 5th anniversary. Upskill Houston is an employer-led initiative which mobilizes the collective action of more than 200 critical stakeholders to strengthen the pipeline of skilled workers that employers need and to create better pathways to opportunity and prosperity for all Houstonians. The Upskill Houston initiative focuses on addressing the challenges our region faces with filling positions that require education and skills and credentials beyond a high school diploma, but less than a bachelor's degree. And while we've been working to address the gap in middle skill workers and strengthen our K-12 system, the partnership has also been working toward growing the greater Houston region's higher education ecosystem. And this will be the focus of today's discussion. As our region recovers from the pandemic and economic downturn, we must recognize the important role higher education will play in that recovery and for preparing our workforce for the future. In a recent report, Houston was ranked 3rd among the world's top cities of the future for global business investment, human capital, and lifestyle. That was by FDI Intelligence magazine a couple of weeks ago. This ranking is evidence of Houston's strong place among the great global cities and is illustrative of the advancements we have made to build an educated workforce that meets the needs of our region's key industries. But there's still a great deal of work to do to ensure we are able to maintain this position. Part of this work has been the advancement of innovation in Houston, particularly of the digital variety, and our region has made tremendous wins and success of late in the digital tech space. Just this year alone, Microsoft, Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, and a group called Greentown Labs have all made major expansion announcements here in Houston. So we're making progress. But we still have a long way to go. And it's important that we look closely at how our higher ed institutions are supporting this region's development. As you undoubtedly saw just this week, U.S. News and World Report released their 2021 rankings of the best national universities. Rice University and the University of Houston both received high rankings on this list, with Rice landing the 16th spot among the nation's top schools, public and private, and the University of Houston ranked 87th on the top public universities in the country. This report shows that Houston institutions are getting stronger and continuing to grow. Unfortunately, however, while the region has grown our local institutions, we're still sending more high schoolers to non-Houston area education institutions across the state than we are seeing move back to Houston upon graduation. So Houston higher ed institutions, they also receive traditionally less public funding per student than their counterparts on average across the state. So these are all truths that we must change in order to further strengthen Houston's higher education ecosystem. Our general conclusion is that we need to continue to improve and extend the reach of the higher education institutions located here in the metro area, and Rice and University of Houston being chief among them, but there are many other quality institutions in the region as well. And the business community needs to give them our full support. And we should leverage our outstanding community college system as well, both as an end in itself in terms of credentials and degrees, but also as a feeder system into the four-year colleges. With that said, I'm proud to announce that the partnership is launching a new initiative known as the Greater Houston Hub, HUB, Greater Houston Hub, standing for Higher Education United with Business. This initiative will be led by the partnership's Higher Education Chair, Thad Hill, along with a cabinet composed of CEOs from key industry sectors, as well as higher education presidents and chancellors from across the region. The goals of the Greater Houston Hub are simple yet noble. Grow Houston's current and future talent by creating a sustainable partnership between industry and higher education institutions. Support the growth of Houston's higher ed ecosystem by increasing student enrollment, student quality, degrees and certificates awarded, and available funding sources. And improve the perception and reality of Houston as an innovation and education hub through the talent and research produced by the region's higher ed institutions. We look forward to sharing more about this initiative in the months to come. Many of the topics that Thad and Commissioner Keller will discuss today will be reflective of the work we seek to achieve through the Greater Houston Hub, and I look forward to hearing these discussions. With that, I'd like to turn our program to the fireside chat and introduce today's moderator, Thad Hill. Thad, as you know, is president and CEO of Calpine Corporation. He has served as Calpine's CEO and a member of his board of directors since May 2014. Thad was awarded the Institutional Investor Mid-Cap CEO of the Year in 2018. Calpine Corporation is one of the nation's largest independent, integrated, competitive power companies, operating power plants and retail businesses in 25 states plus Ontario. Calpine is the largest gas-fired generator in the United States and operates the largest geothermal resource. And on the power retail side, it has Calpine Energy Services, which serves large commercial and industrial customers, and Champion Energy Services focused on all types of customers here in Texas. Thad currently serves on the MBA advisory board for the Tuck School at Dartmouth, and he's a former national trustee for Boys and Girls Clubs. In addition to his role at Calpine, Thad is actively engaged with the partnership, serving on our executive committee, acting as chair of our Higher Ed Public Policy Advisory Committee, and chair of our just announced Higher Ed initiative, the Greater Houston Hub. So Thad, thank you for all you do at the partnership, for your leadership in this region, and we're honored to have you leading today's discussion with Commissioner Keller. The floor is yours.
Bob, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon to discuss the state of education with you, Commissioner Keller, and the education and business leaders from across the region that are tuned in today. Again, I'm Thad Hill, President and CEO of Calpine Corporation. As Bob said, these are trying times in our country. We're finding ourselves facing an unprecedented pandemic, confronting issues of systemic racism and social justice, and steeling ourselves against natural disasters for our business, wildfires in California, part of our business, and also here, certainly in Houston, with threats from an historically active hurricane season in the Gulf. Never has our educational system been so challenged, and never has there been a greater need for a community to support access to high-quality education and provide opportunity for all. We are proud at Calpine that Texas is a big part of our business and that Houston is our home. Our philanthropic efforts, both here and nationally, are focused on equality of opportunity. The responsibility for engaging in and supporting our communities is one Calpine takes seriously and is core to who we are. A key pillar of the quality of opportunity is education, which is why we are pleased to be the platinum sponsor today for the event featuring Harrison Keller from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. The Coordinating Board works throughout the state to provide leadership and coordination for higher education institutions to create a globally competitive workforce. Commissioner Keller will be discussing innovation within the Coordinating Board and what to expect in the state's higher education system in a post-COVID-19 world, which will be here hopefully soon. Following the fireside chat, Commissioner Keller will take questions from the audience. So please utilize the Q&A feature on your screen to submit your question. And we're also going to go ahead and ask some questions during the presentation that were pre-submitted by our audience. So now it's my honor to introduce Commissioner Harrison Keller, who chairs the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Commissioner Keller is a sixth-generation Texan with more than 2 decades of experience in education in the areas of budget, policy, digital learning, and coalition building among school districts, colleges, and policymakers. He is the 6th Commissioner of Higher Education and Chief Executive Officer for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and was appointed October 1st in 2019. He is a recognized innovator in policy and programs to improve college readiness and student success, especially for low-income and first-generation students. He came to the Coordinating Board from the University of Texas, where he was Deputy to the President for Strategy and Policy and a Professor of Practice. Dr. Keller also served at UT Austin as Vice Provost of Higher Education Policy and Research and Executive Director of the Office for Educational Innovation and the Center for Teaching and Learning. Dr. Keller has taught at Georgetown University, St. Edward's University, and UT Austin. He holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Notre Dame and an MA and PhD in philosophy from Georgetown. He and his wife, Gina Neves Keller, live in Austin with their 3 kids. So, Dr. Keller, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today and supporting Houston's future by supporting education in our community. I really look forward to our discussion.
Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today, Dan.
Thank you. So you're approaching the end of your first year. As I just mentioned, your term started, it'll be a year on October 1st. And the partnership had a chance to meet with you just in your first 30 days as commissioner back in October of 2019. And I know it's only been a year since you took the position, but what a year it's been. I know it feels a lot longer. At the start of your term, you discussed the innovation you wanted to bring forth to Texas higher education institutions during your tenure. Looking back, what are some of the changes you had a chance to get going before the pandemic began, and how has the pandemic accelerated or altered your plans?
Okay, great. Well, it does seem like a lot longer time. That was back in the day when we could actually meet in person. And so some of the things I talked about with the partnership team are slowed down a little bit, but others have become even more urgent. And in some cases, we've been able to accelerate our efforts. So let me just talk about a few examples. So first, one of my overarching goals as commissioner has been to transition our agency from a more traditional regulatory posture to being able to be a more effective resource, advocate, and credible partner for Texas higher education. So as part of that, we reorganized the agency to put a stronger focus on collaboration and on working partnerships with our institutions, the legislature, economic development organizations, of course, including the partnership, and other stakeholders. And I was excited to bring on a new executive team to lead this new structure. But unfortunately, our new team only got about 6 weeks together in the office before we had to transition to teleworking. So these are all senior leaders who are well known across Texas higher education and in the Capitol. And I've been excited about the ways we're coming together to help our institutions navigate the crisis and to lay groundwork for a better future. But still, the pandemic slowed down our recruiting and our onboarding for a number of key positions within the agency on their teams. The second example would be that last February, Governor Abbott issued new charges for the governor's tri-agency workforce initiative. And that's comprised of the Coordinating Board, TA, and the Workforce Commission to support our long-term workforce needs across the state and make sure we've got better alignment and coordination across our educational and workforce development initiatives. So that tri-agency work has continued despite all the challenges of these past few months, and the agencies are working together right now to assemble recommendations for each of the governor's charges. So there'll be a report, but more importantly, there are a number of initiatives we're already moving forward. So, for example, at our agency, two of the major strands of work we're leading are modernizing the state's educational and workforce data infrastructure and creating better alignment around college and career advising from middle school through post-secondary education and into adult learners. So Commissioner Mike Morath, Chairman Brian Daniel continue to be great partners, and I want to say also that I appreciate the partnership's input and assistance in all these efforts. And third, I'm excited and enthusiastic about the important work that we've been able to accelerate with federal funds that are part of the governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. So this summer, Governor Abbott and the legislative leadership came together and they committed $175 million to Texas higher education from those discretionary federal CARES Act funds. And the biggest portion of that, about $150 million, has been allocated through our agency to institutions so we can maintain our major state financial aid programs, so we can provide additional emergency financial aid to students, and also to provide financial aid to help folks reskill and upskill. So the rest of the funding was granted to us to help accelerate our work on the educational workforce data infrastructure and also to improve online teaching and learning in colleges and universities across the state. So there are some things that are slowed down and there are other things we've been able to dramatically accelerate.
Great. Well, I mean, as I said, it's been quite a year. So you mentioned data modernization in your comments. Data modernization and sharing across the state's institutions is critical, obviously, to the growth and collaboration across the state. Can you tell us how we do, how Texas does, against our peers or even our competitors, if you want to think about it that way, when it comes to data sharing and access across agencies, and what are the benefits of sharing the data?
Yeah, thanks. Well, Texas is nationally known for the scope of our educational and workforce data. We have unbelievable data in Texas, and our agency, the Coordinating Board, is the hub for all the combined data from the Coordinating Board, from the Texas Education Agency, and the Texas Workforce Commission. There's a lot of great information you can extract from all this data, but it hasn't always been easy to access or to work with. So one of my high priorities as commissioner has been to better harness that state data about student demographics, enrollment, performance, workforce outcomes, so we can help people make better and more informed decisions. So as I mentioned, the governor and the legislative leadership committed a portion of the GEAR funds to our agency to accelerate our data infrastructure modernization. And the aim of that work is to implement a state data infrastructure and interactive tools for students and families, for higher education leaders, policymakers, employers, and the general public. We're also bringing in other data sets and tools from national partners like the National Student Clearinghouse or the U.S. Census and other third-party organizations so we can help provide insights about what's happening to students in the educational pipeline and as they transition into the workforce. So the result of all of this is going to be new systems, interactive tools, better intelligence, so we can help inform our Texas students and parents about their college and career opportunities, so we can support our institutional efforts to improve academic programs and drive student success efforts, and also so we can give policymakers clear, accessible, and better intelligence to inform their decisions.
Thank you. And we've talked about the pandemic a couple of times. So 6 months ago, when it kind of took hold, it upended everybody's lives and everything substantially. It happened mid-semester in the academic world, halfway through the spring, and institutions were forced to quickly pivot and to ensure that their students completed their coursework in a very different environment. Can you talk about the coordinating of board support for campuses and kind of how that all played out in the middle of the spring?
Yeah, of course. COVID-19 has caused significant disruption to our institutions of higher ed, for our students, for our workforce, and for our own agencies. So our students and institutions continue to face some significant challenges and a lot of uncertainty, of course. This has been the greatest disruption to the operations of our Texas colleges and universities since the end of the Second World War. So I spent a lot of time talking with higher ed leaders across the state. And I have to say that in the face of all these challenges, our institutions of higher ed continue to rise to the occasion. And I want to commend them on their efforts to keep their students, their faculty, their staff safe. I think the changes they've made on campus have largely been effective. Like, they've put most of their large classes online. They've staggered their class schedules. They're sanitizing. They're emphasizing hygiene, masks, and social distancing. Where we're seeing problems is more often in what the students are doing off campus or in their off hours. So the coordinating board's primary role in all this since the beginning of the crisis has mostly been to act as a facilitator, as a partner, and as an advocate for our institutions as they're navigating these challenges. So we're serving as a resource in collecting and disseminating information to help students navigate the disruption, to help institutions have the best guidance available. We're working with the governor, the legislative leadership, other state agencies to provide additional regulatory flexibility so institutions can adapt to the COVID-19 crisis and continue to serve students. And we've also been supporting both our public and private institutions to help them ensure their continuity of operations and continuity of instruction for students. So along those lines, we work closely with public health experts and our institutions to develop guidance for reopening their campus operations for the summer and fall semesters. So that include checklists of recommended health protocols with the most current federal and state public health and safety recommendations for our post-secondary institutions. In addition, our Texas Higher Ed Foundation worked together with the Greater Texas Foundation and the Trellis Foundation to initiate the Texas Emergency Grant Aid program to support students across our public and private higher ed institutions during the COVID-19 crisis. So this initiative has been raising private funds and providing grants to support our institutions' emergency aid programs and also help them provide additional direct assistance to students who've been impacted by COVID-19. And as I mentioned, one of the most significant recent actions we've been able to take on behalf of our students and institutions relates to $175 million in CARES Act funding through the GEAR Fund that we've secured for Texas higher education. So I mentioned that already, but I just want to underline that I think it represents a powerful statement from our state leadership that I'm not seeing in all the other states. So our Texas leadership recognizes the importance of higher education for getting through this crisis and for driving the recovery. So this funding is going to be very important for helping tens of thousands of Texas students continue or restart their progress towards earning post-secondary credentials or degrees.
Well, we're back on campus now in most places, higher ed, and obviously the institutions are working their way through some of the items you mentioned. Any long-term impacts when you kind of look out into the horizon, key learnings or fundamental changes? Or
yeah, for the longer term, I think so. If you look at the history of higher education, it's full of all these declarations about paradigm shifts and crossroads and watersheds and that kind of thing. Most of that doesn't end up being true. Some of that ends up sometimes being sort of a marker of missed opportunities. This is different. I really do think that we're going to look back on this year as a watershed, an important inflection point in the history of higher education. So as in a number of industries, this disruption has been accelerating some changes that we were already seeing, but it's also opened doors to other things we didn't anticipate. So higher ed leaders and faculty and policymakers are rethinking a lot of traditional practices and sacred cows, from how they deliver instruction to what their academic calendars look like, to who they enroll and who they're called to serve. So in particular, I think we have an opportunity to make some significant strides in what we're doing with digital learning, in online course design and delivery that could dramatically change how we think about teaching and learning, what post-secondary credentials represent, and also the kind of institutional infrastructures that we're going to need.
Right. So This past summer, enrollment across the state in higher education institutions were up and higher than expected. What do you think drove that? And what do you think it means? And I know we're just beginning to get numbers, but what do you think it means for subsequent semesters?
So historically, higher ed institutions often see increases in enrollments during economic downturns because you have more people who need to reskill and upskill. And that pattern usually ends up being particularly pronounced at community and technical colleges. This summer, our enrollments started out low, but then they ended up resolving to an average of being up about 11% over a year earlier. Now, some of that might have been driven by students not having as many opportunities for summer jobs and internships. But one of the things I want to flag is that we saw considerable variation in summer enrollments across institutions. So, for example, about 2/3 of the community colleges ended up showing increased enrollments for the summer, but the variance in the percent of increase or decrease, it varied from about 87% down to 107% up for the first summer session. Our enrollments at the Texas State Technical Colleges and at community college at career and technology programs also ended up being down. So we're monitoring the fall enrollments very closely. Right now, anecdotally, it looks like enrollments are going to be down, especially at the institutions that serve larger numbers of low-income students. So our broad access institutions, our HBCUs, many of our community colleges are reporting informally that they have lower enrollments for the fall, and we'll have more detailed numbers in October.
Unemployment is a real issue in the state of Texas right now, particularly among those that are lacking a degree or credential. They're being disproportionately impacted. What efforts are underway at the coordinating board to improve attainment, degree or credential completion, and how will these efforts improve our statistics and build our future workforce?
Yeah, I so appreciate you raising that question because that is a critical issue for Texas. So the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census estimates that we have more than 3.9 million Texans with some college and no degree. And we know that right now these people are especially vulnerable because the unemployment rates for American workers who only have high school diplomas or who have some college and no credential are more than twice as high as the unemployment rates for workers with bachelor's degrees. Now, when we look at the data, we also know we have a lot of these folks who are within striking distance of finishing. Sometimes it's within just a couple of courses within the semester or less than a year. So if we can provide opportunities and incentives to get these Texans to re-enroll at a Texas institution, that can open doors for them to reskill and upskill, to get back on their feet. Maybe that means getting onto a new career path and helping to drive the state's recovery. So earlier this year, pre-COVID, we had already initiated a reboot of our GradTex initiative at the coordinating board to re-engage our some college and no credential population. And we started with the greater Houston region. So this is a comprehensive regional strategy that brings our agency team together with institutions, with business representatives, with community organizations, and we appreciate the opportunity to work closely on this with the Greater Houston Partnership. So there's several things that make Houston an especially compelling place to do this work. So that includes the strong collaborative leadership you have in the business community and among your higher ed institutions, and also the fact that there could be as many as 1 million Texans in the greater Houston region who have some college and no credential who could benefit from these kinds of opportunities to reskill and upskill. So in our legislative appropriations request, we didn't ask for a lot of additional funding beyond a request for financial aid, but we did request additional funds in state funding to help build on and support the GradTex initiative and extend these resources to communities across the state. And additionally, I want to flag that within the GEAR funds I was talking about, $46.5 million of the funds that were earmarked for financial aid and awarded to the coordinating board was specifically allocated for displaced workers who need to reskill or upskill to get back into the workforce, or folks who have some college and no credential. We have some other financial aid sources like our college access loans to support reskilling and upskilling. But all of this is especially urgent right now because, again, we know these shocks to the economy, they're accelerating changes in our workforce needs. We know we've had 3.5 million Texans file for unemployment since March, and a lot of those same jobs aren't coming back, or they're not coming back quickly. So we're going to have to move quickly to help folks reskill and upskill. And so I think together our work with you and your colleagues at the partnership and in the business community, along with targeted financial aid, is going to be very important for helping our institutions develop more capacity and expertise to engage that some college and no credential population and to help them attain the kind of credentials that are going to align with new career opportunities.
Well, speaking on behalf of the partnership, we're thrilled to be partnering with you in this Grad Tex 2.0, and a shout out to Tiffany Tatum on the partnership staff who's coordinating that from our side. So thank you so much for letting us be a part of that, Commissioner. So I'm going to shift the topic a little bit. The post-secondary degree attainment, as we just discussed, is a significant impact factor to supporting workforce development. Can you share some examples of how the coordinating board is working with the business community and in order to help meet these needs? And also ask you, as kind of maybe a second part of this question, to give us some advice for the folks here that are participating from the business community. What can we do to help grow Houston's higher education ecosystem and help this process?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So a critical area of this next several months where I think close partnerships with employers and organizations like the partnership are going to be essential is going to be around how we identify and promote and advise students to pursue credentials of value. I've talked about this a little bit around our state higher education goals. So let's stipulate that in general, it would be a good thing for Texas to have better educational attainment. And the central goal of the state's higher education plan is to have 60% of our young working population attain some kind of post-secondary credential by 2030. But I don't think it's enough to say we want to aim for 60% of our young working population to achieve any kind of post-secondary credential. We want to make sure that we're promoting high-value credentials, especially credentials that are going to align with regional and state workforce needs and with jobs that are high wage or at least connected to high economic mobility. So the way that this work is going to need to happen is going to be through closer and more effective collaborations at the state level with the coordinating board, the workforce commission, and with the TEA in the kind of projects that I described. But of course, where most of the hard work is going to get done is going to be through these strong regional collaborations. So we need to make sure that our state efforts are effectively supporting and enhancing and accelerating your regional efforts, especially your new Greater Houston Hub initiative. So for advice, I have to say I've long admired the relationship between the higher ed ecosystem and the business community in Houston, and so I'm excited about the opportunity to work with you all on the partnership team. But I might suggest that there's a number of ways I think in general the business community can be an active partner in growing the ecosystem in Houston and across the state. So some of the main ones that would come to mind offhand, first would be about identifying and enrolling students, especially potential students who might be good candidates to upskill. So doing that engagement in close partnership with the employers. We need to strengthen our feedback mechanisms between the business community and higher education. And that means things like expanding proven strategies like internships and effective employer advisory boards. Now, in some disciplines in higher education, we're very good at this. So in accounting and engineering, computer science, architecture, even performing arts. But we need to get a lot better at understanding the specific skills that students are going to need across a much wider spectrum of disciplines. And we don't have those feedback mechanisms established across the board right now. Now, there's some great examples of direct collaborations also between institutions and employers, where institutions have built whole curricula that align with employer-specific needs. So, for example, I think the University of Houston's done a great job with their Conrad Hilton College of Hotel and Restaurant Management, or you could look at the programs at the Maritime Technology and Training Center at San Jacinto College. There's there are many more of these kinds of partnerships we should be developing and supporting so we can minimize the gaps between post-secondary credentials and success in the workforce, so that when someone steps into that new job, they should know and the employer should know that they're ready to do the next thing. And then last, I'd mention that, of course, in Houston, you understand the importance of research and development. And so I think we're going to need help in making the best possible case for university-connected and university-based R&D. So Houston can become even more of a hub for innovation and technology commercialization. Now, of course, we've made major strides, as you mentioned, and we still have a long way to go, especially so we can draw down more of our fair share of federal research dollars and attract more venture capital to Greater Houston and Texas. The last thing I'd say is that I'm going to need your help from an advocacy standpoint, because historically, when the state budgets in Texas and other states are down, higher ed takes disproportionate cuts, and then that drives up tuition and that drives up student debt. And in the situation we're in, that traditional playbook can slow down our recovery because we have so many people who need to reskill and upskill. Higher ed has a special role and responsibility to play in driving economic recovery, and it's one of the ways that we're going to get through this, and we're going to emerge with a stronger and more resilient workforce for the future.
So I want to come back, time permitting, to the 2021 legislature and what that can mean for our education in a minute. But first, I want to talk about, when I mentioned in my opening comments, as Bob did, there's a national reckoning going on right now around racial equity. And oftentimes the conversation when it comes to education does revolve around the K through 12, public education, the digital divide. But there's stark disparities in higher education too, and in educational attainment for the Black community and other minority groups. So what is the role of the coordinating board in working with the higher education institutions and really focusing on this equity gap?
So our fundamental responsibility in higher ed is to unlock individual potential for the benefit of society. And I think there's never been a more important time for us to recommit ourselves to the principle that everyone should have the opportunity to contribute to and participate in the great benefits of our state. So already we know the COVID-19 crisis has had a disproportionate impact on our Black and Hispanic communities. And when we look into the kind of data I was talking about before, we see that students of color are less likely to enroll, and they're more likely to delay college graduation as a result of these recent disruptions, and this crisis isn't over yet. So today, Texas is the 10th largest economy in the world, but we need to help folks understand that we will never achieve our full potential if we don't make substantial improvements in educating our Black and Hispanic population. So I think there's several things we can do for the near term and for the long term to try to promote equity through higher education, and we can support through the coordinating board. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that the governor and the legislative leadership came together and they allocated additional funding to institutions for emergency financial aid, and that's on top of what students are already receiving from federal, state, and institutional grant aid. So making sure that financial aid is available, that it's strategic, and that it's predictable for students and their families is going to be critically important for helping these students enroll and stay on track. Second, through the Tri-Agency Initiative, our agency is taking the lead on college and career advising. So we're working in partnership with our colleagues at the Workforce Commission and TEA. We need to make sure that every current and potential student, no matter where they live, from middle school through higher education to adults already in the workforce, is going to be able to access high quality, accurate, personalized advising about the kinds of educational and career opportunities that are available to them. Another place, of course, that we've talked about is where we're taking the lead on modernizing our state educational and workforce data infrastructure. And so how this relates and how it's important is because we can help identify and engage talented students from all backgrounds earlier in the educational pipeline than we're doing today. We can provide actionable intelligence to institutions about how students are navigating the programs and where they fall off track so they can focus their student success efforts. We can better inform our policy decisions that can bolster students' paths through post-secondary education and in the workforce, and help us all understand what's happening within our institutions and within our economy. And finally, like for now and the long term, we're looking forward to working with the legislature and in close partnership with our institutions to support discussions about how to improve equity in the higher education finance system. So thanks to the last legislative session, as Bob mentioned in his opening remarks, our Texas public school finance system today is one of the most equitable in the nation. But in higher education finance, we make zero adjustments for the cost of educating students who come from different backgrounds, who have different needs. And that's a problem, especially for our colleges that serve more poor and educationally disadvantaged students. So despite the uncertainties around the state budget, we look forward to actively participating in and supporting these policy discussions. I could go on and on, but this is a topic I'm passionate about, and we're actively engaged, and we're working on this in partnership with our institutions and our policymakers.
So there have been no questions that have come in from the audience. So I'm going to ask one last question and maybe wrap it up. I mentioned the legislature a minute ago. And we know this higher ed is always a topic in the legislative session. You've also referenced how tough it's going to be this year. Obviously, there will be massive shortfalls, and this will be the dominant, or one of the couple of dominant themes at the legislature. So as we look towards the session, what can we expect to be your priorities and the coordinating board's priorities with the legislature?
So we recently submitted our legislative appropriations request to the governor and to the legislative budget board, and as per their instructions, that included a 5% reduction for the upcoming biennium. So our highest priorities in the LAR are centered around need-based financial aid, and also recommending some cost-effective strategic ways that the governor and legislative leadership can help support our institutions and our Texas students. Now, I've spent more than 2 decades working on different aspects of Texas public and higher education budget and policy, and I appreciate how complex and difficult the decisions are that the legislature is facing in the coming session. But I've also been making the case that higher education shouldn't be the release valve for the state's budget shortfalls. Instead, higher ed needs to be an active partner in driving economic recovery. It's different from a lot of other parts of the state budget because there's a return on this investment that's tangible and it's near term. And right now, a lot of Texans are unemployed. A lot of Texas students and their families are hurting. So in particular, I think this is not the time to walk away from our commitment to financial aid, especially when so many people need to reskill and upskill. So Texas has been a national leader in need-based financial aid, and let's not take our foot off the gas pedal there. So our first exceptional item request was restoration of the 5% funding reductions, because the majority of that request, about $57 million, would restore our major need-based financial aid programs. And then we've also requested an additional $110 million to support student financial aid, which is about how much money we'd need just to maintain the current share of eligible students who could access our need-based financial aid program. So access to financial aid is a critical factor in whether students are going to enroll, persist, and complete in their higher education journey. As I mentioned before, we also have a $4 million request to scale insights coming out of the GradTex initiative so we can expand access to these resources that we're re-engineering, working with the partnership, working with Houston institutions and employers so we can re-engage adult learners and support them in completing high-value credentials. Now, as we're going into the session, I've said many times that the coordinating board won't have a coordinating board legislative agenda. When I joined the agency, one of my main priorities was to renew the coordinating board's mission as a partner with and advocate for Texas higher education. So I think the agenda should be the governor's agenda, should be the legislative leadership's agenda, should be higher education's agenda. And our role is to inform and support and partner in all these discussions. I think that when we have more informed policy deliberations, we're more likely to end up with better policy for our students, for our institutions, for our communities, and for our great state.
Well, again, on behalf of the partnership, we look forward to working with you. Higher education funding is important, and particularly the equity issues which you addressed a few minutes ago. So hopefully we can be helpful to you in your participating as a good source of information to the governor and legislators. So Dr. Keller, thank you so much for being with us today. This is our second annual State of Education event, and it was just a fascinating conversation. So thank you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Bob for closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Thad. And Harrison, two reactions. One is I am so thankful you're in this role, and I am so glad that I'm not. I mean, the breadth of your agenda is amazing, but frankly, very comforting to me because the issues that you're attempting to address are all so legitimate. And to see the coordinating board, really, as you said, acting as a resource for the state and for the higher education community rather than simply as a regulator is again, also very reassuring. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for joining us today. Thad, thank you for playing this role in this event today, but thank you for leading the partnership's higher education efforts. There's a lot to be done. Houston brings so many strengths to this issue, but we have challenges and opportunities. And for the Houston higher ed ecosystem, I think we need to focus on the opportunities we now have before us. I want to thank all of you who've joined us this afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today. I hope that you consider the partnership a trusted resource and an advocate for the interests of Greater Houston, not just in higher education, but across the board. We have a number of events coming up. Let me just touch on them quickly. We have a very busy fall schedule. Frankly, we have the State of the Houston region, where we shift our focus beyond Harris County. I'll call them the outlying counties. And we'll have a great discussion around that with a number of the county judges. That's on September 25th, right around the corner. We have the State of the Airports, the plural, obviously, given the 3 airports that the city of Houston operates. That's on October 2nd. And then we have State of the Port on October 13th with Rick Campo, chair of the port. Details on all these and all of our upcoming events can be found at houston.org/events. So thank you for tuning in today. We really appreciate your support of the partnership. Please have a great afternoon and a great weekend. Stay well, and thank you for being here today. Thank you for your support. See you all later.